When you look at any list of the greatest moments in Fullmetal Alchemist, there is one scene you can nearly always count on ending up near the top. The fight between Roy Mustang and Lust, if you can even call it a fight, in FMAB's 19th episode is widely considered not just the most unforgettable scene in the series, but one of the most epic, satisfying, and all-around badass moments in all of anime. And for a long time, I've been very interested in digging into why. Now, I'm sure that to some it may seem a bit pointless to analyze a scene like this one. After all, it's pretty obvious why this scene slaps, right? Right? However, I recently watched the first, Lord help me, there's 3 of them, of the live-action Fullmetal Alchemist films in which this scene is the climax, and when it happened, I felt nothing. It was my favorite character's signature moment and the emotional crux of the film, and it left me completely cold. This left me more convinced than ever that the strength of this scene runs a lot deeper than badass fireman go burr, and that after 2 years on YouTube, I should quit procrastinating and finally carry out my plan of unpacking this masterpiece of a fight once and for all. Well, the wait is finally over, dear viewers. Today, I will be unpacking the 3 key storytelling ingredients that make the Roy vs. Lust fight hit different, and how the live-action version manages to screw up every single one of them. It is a truth universally acknowledged in FMA discourse that Roy is the most OP character in Fullmetal Alchemist. Or at least the most OP ordinary human who doesn't have a Philosopher's Stone embedded in their organs. However, in the wrong hands, this could make any fight scene involving Roy quite bland and one-sided. When all you have to do to waste your opponent is stand still and snap your fingers, it doesn't really make for the most dynamic fight choreography. Hiromu Arakawa and the animation directors of Brotherhood clearly knew this and did a great deal with the fight's animation and shot composition to make it not only visually interesting, but legitimately harrowing. In spite of both Roy and Lust staying in one place for the duration of the scene, the anime's Lust fight is full of motion. Rather than staying chained to the combatants, the camera creates a sense of constant movement by following both of their attacks. When the camera stays still, it's either to get a wider angle and showcase the spectacle of it all, or to get up close and personal, as in this shot of the flames reflecting in Roy's eyes. Even when the shot stays in one place, something is still always moving. The fire twists and contorts and crashes in on itself, so powerful that the camera shakes from its sheer force. But we all know the fire isn't the hottest thing in this scene. Am I right, ladies?
I love how cold and focused your eyes are.
Not only does this scene look incredible, but it sounds incredible. I know battle scherzo is used in several of Brotherhood's fights, but it just feels so perfectly tailor-made for this scene. I love how the rise and fall of the brass calls to mind a swirling tempest of sparks and smoke filling the room, and the almost jarringly high violin section strikingly captures the searing heat and intensity of Roy's flames. The voice acting also plays a really big part in why this scene works so well. Both Shinichiro Miki and Travis Willingham just absolutely sell every single line, especially Travis, who puts such grit and power and pain behind every word. You fully believe that this is a man with the strength and tenacity to overcome some of the most intense physical agony imaginable in order to get the job done.
You told me I couldn't kill you, but I'd like to try and prove you wrong! So let's see. How many times is it gonna take?
Laura Bailey's also no slouch in her final outing as Lust, delivering some of the most terrifying and bone-chilling screams in anime dubbing history. And when the music cuts out so all you hear is screaming and the absolutely stunning sound design of the explosions, it all just feels so real and visceral. In terms of pure spectacle, the live-action version doesn't hold a candle to the animes, but it's still fairly impressive for a non-animated film with a relatively small budget. The camera angles aren't as inspired here, and the soundtrack isn't nearly as memorable, but the fire looks decent, it's better shot and edited than the majority of the film, and Dean Fujioka really does seem to be trying with his delivery, which is more than you can say for his performance in the rest of the movie. However, I think one of the biggest problems with the live-action version of this scene is that it's almost completely lacking in tension. In the anime, as powerful as Roy is, Lust is still a gosh dang force to be reckoned with. She fights back, and she fights back hard. In fact, in the shot right before she finally disintegrates, we see that her claw came mere centimeters short of piercing Roy's eye. But in the Netflix version, the second Roy snaps, it's pretty much over. Lust kind of just collapses without putting up any sort of resistance. She doesn't even regenerate. You know, like homunculi are supposed to be able to do because they're immortal, and killing them is supposed to be super freaking difficult. But no, this weak sauce Walmart lust just immediately goes all, no, I'm melting, leaving FMA's sole female villain looking absolutely pathetic, and Roy's defeat of her far less impressive by proxy. The anime's version of Lust's death also feels so much more raw and infinitely more painful. You get all of these grotesque angles and grisly close-ups of her skin burning off layer by layer, combined with these more wild, abstract scribbles that truly capture the feeling of being burned alive better than any live-action visuals I've ever seen. The movie, meanwhile, doesn't show Lust's body decaying at all until her actual death, which looks more like a very early prototype of the end of Infinity War. I get that burning alive is probably really difficult to pull off with believable effects, but hey, Terminator 2 pulled it off 30 years ago and scarred me for life in the process. The movie also has Roy defeat Lust not by spamming PK Fire so many times that she runs out of lives, but by grabbing the Philosopher's Stone out of her chest, which in the original doesn't work, because as long as the stone is intact, Lust can still regenerate. You want to know how I know this? Because in the anime, Roy literally tries to do the exact same thing, and Lust responds by regenerating around his hand and impaling him, which is why he has to get through the entire fight with a giant gash in his stomach in the first place! But for now, I'm done being so negative because we've only scratched the surface of what makes this scene so
talented, brilliant, incredible, amazing, show-stopping, spectacular.
Let's talk about narrative structure. Catharsis, a purification or purgation of the emotions, primarily through art, often bringing about a spiritual renewal or release from tension. As a longtime thespian, catharsis is a term that I am intimately familiar with, and there are a few things I can think of more cathartic than this. But in order to understand what gives this scene such powerful hype factor, we must first take a look at what came before it. For a lot of people, Death of the Undying is the episode they point to when telling their uninitiated friends where Brotherhood goes from excellent to a masterpiece, and even though my personal favorite episode comes a lot later in the series, I still have to agree that objectively, this is Fullmetal Alchemist at its finest. Death of the Undying is just a sublime 25 minutes of television. It's excruciatingly tense, tightly paced, and it culminates with some of the series' most definitive and deeply moving character moments. The rising action of this episode does an excellent job amping up the stakes and building Lust up as this near impossible obstacle. Her reflexes are basically flawless, bullets are a mere inconvenience, and even when Roy manages to blow up an entire room with her in it, she's still able to bounce right back and leave both Roy and Havoc in dire need of medical attention. We switch scenes on a classic cliffhanger, our boys are bleeding out on the lab floor, Roy's gloves are shredded, and the audience is left on the edge of their seats wondering how on earth they are gonna get out of this. The emotional roller coaster continues as the next scene adds a layer of intense human drama. Lust tells Riza that Roy's dead and it absolutely shatters her. Not only is it incredibly powerful to see such a strong, collected character in a moment of such explosive vulnerability, but it also serves to create even more suspense. Seeing how earth-shattering the possibility of losing Roy is for Riza makes us even more concerned with whether or not he'll make it out alive. We see how deeply she cares for him and thus we care about him even more. And as raw and visceral as it is to watch Lust burn alive, oh boy, listening to Riza's wails of sheer grief and agony is probably twice as painful. Riza, for all of her firearms prowess, is ultimately no match for a creature like Lust, though she does likely weaken her just enough for Roy to be able to finish her off. And once her canister is empty, presumably leaving just one bullet for herself, she crumples to the ground, having entirely lost her will to live. In a beautiful moment of character growth, Alphonse steps forward to protect her, stating that he's done standing by helplessly as people he cares about die. But even he can only hold her off for so long. So there we have it. Our heroes are gravely injured and in the depths of despair, and things have never looked more hopeless. And then...
Well spoken. I couldn't agree more.
how you set up the dramatic entrance to end all dramatic entrances. If you establish your obstacles, make the audience wait, let them feel horror and anguish alongside your characters, then when you finally reveal that your hero is indeed alive and back to save the day, congratulations, you will almost certainly have all of the fanboys and fangirls and fan NBs standing up in their seats and screaming with joy. None of this is even that complicated. It's just basic, effective storytelling. And I probably sound pretentious as heck trying to explain it to you guys like you don't already understand how it works. But if it's so simple, then how on earth does the live-action film miss the catharsis mark completely? Here's how. Instead of having Roy and Havoc get stabby-stabbed and then cutting to the next scene so that we're on the edge of our seats waiting to find out if they're gonna be okay, Roy still gets stabby-stabbed, but he's just kind of fine? I mean, don't get me wrong, he's still clearly injured and he still burns the wound shut, but it doesn't feel nearly as dire because he has Al and Riza there to help him. His gloves are also intact, so we don't get to see the sheer ingenuity and metalness that is Roy carving a transmutation circle into his hand. The reason that this is a problem is that all of the suspense and opportunity for a dramatic cheer-out-loud moment is completely wasted because we already know Roy's gonna be fine. He has a whole scene between his injury and the lust fight where he's fighting the mannequin soldiers and just kind of limping around. Half of the effectiveness of this scene is in the first 5 seconds and you already screwed it up.
Look how they mess with my boy.
And don't even get me started on how bad of a decision it was not to split Roy, Riza, and Al up, because now we don't get the character development that comes from them thinking they've lost Roy. Riza's breakdown is so important because it's the first indication we get that she puts heartbreakingly little value on her own life, that she doesn't even believe herself worthy of one. It foreshadows the very climax of both her and Roy's character arcs, where she is once again faced with the possibility of a world without him and simply cannot comprehend it, because not only would she lose the man she loves, but the very hopes of redemption that she has dedicated her entire life to reaching. But no, forget about all of that, because in spite of the fact that Misako Renbutsu is far and away the most nuanced and competent performer in the cast, Riza doesn't matter to this movie. She's not a character, she's just a prop. Al too! We can't give Al more than one impactful scene in this movie because we don't want to spend too much money on mediocre CGI. Let's have him run off to find Winry and then come back, put up one stone barrier, and do literally nothing else. Oh, I told myself I wouldn't get this angry. Havoc isn't in this movie at all, so that makes the stakes a lot lower for Roy, and Roy also talks way too much in this scene. Like, in the anime, he has his badass one-liners at the beginning and then lets the rest of the fight speak for itself, but here, he will not shut up. We don't need you to tell us this is for Hughes. The target audience for this movie is not infants. Back on the topic of the scene being utterly tensionless, there's no subtly ominous aftertaste to this scene like there is in the anime. One of the coolest things about Lust's death is her coldly dignified final speech, which foreshadows Roy losing his eyesight later in the series, but that doesn't happen here because this movie seems extremely reluctant to give the female characters anything unique to do. Not to mention, this movie doesn't treat Roy's injury realistically at all. In the anime, he has just enough strength to make it through the fight, and then he immediately collapses and has to be sent to the hospital. Not only is it so much more believable that way, but taking it away robs us of this really sweet moment where Riza and Al immediately run to support him, and he regards them with such softness, and it's such a lovely and yes, very cathartic note to end the scene on. It adds so much to the feeling of having been on this emotional roller coaster with these characters, but no, we can't possibly show Roy Mustang being vulnerable. Vulnerability. It's a word that's very important to Roy Mustang as a character, something this movie doesn't seem to be too concerned with, which is honestly a shame, because in my opinion, the true brilliance of this scene lies not in the flashy explosions or the hype factor of the thing, but in what it tells us about Roy himself. When you look at most of the characters in Fullmetal Alchemist, with a few notable exceptions, it's generally pretty safe to say that you know exactly what kind of character they are within the first 5 minutes of meeting them. Take Ed, for instance. By the end of the first episode, you know most of his core character traits. He's stubborn, temperamental, clever, mischievous, and has a strong sense of right and wrong. But with a character like Roy, who must keep so much of his feelings and motives hidden, the series takes a different approach, gradually building up and revealing Roy's true character throughout the first third or so of the series. There are 3 scenes in particular which I think serve as establishing moments for Roy's most central character traits. The ending of Separate Destinations establishes his ambitions, while the ending of Cold Flame establishes his strategic prowess and knack for playing the bad guy. Finally, Death of the Undying establishes perhaps Roy's most important traits: his determination and his noble spirit. In my opinion, there is no line in this scene more important than this one.
I seared the wound closed. I came close to passing out from the pain.
I mean, I've mentioned it numerous times in this video, but just let it sink in for a moment. He seared his own wound shut! Like, what else do you want me to say? The thing is, Roy's life isn't exactly happy. He's not Hughes. He doesn't have a wife and daughter he needs to make it home to, and he's forbidden from pursuing a real relationship with the only woman he would ever want to have one with. The loss of his best friend has taken a huge toll on his mental well-being, greater than he even realizes at the time, and he lives every day shouldering the burden of extreme guilt. Maybe somewhere during those excruciating moments on the floor of the laboratory, some part of him was relieved. Relieved that he wouldn't have to spend another moment grieving Hughes or working tirelessly towards an ideal, a redemption that he may never achieve. It would have been so excruciatingly easy for him to just let go. But he can't, because Roy Mustang has a promise to keep. In the flashback at the beginning of the 10th episode, Roy says this: "With what little strength I have, I'll do everything in my power to protect the people I love. And in return, they'll protect the ones they love. It's the least we tiny humans can do for each other." And the ultimate reason this scene is so iconic, so powerful, so satisfying, is because it is when we finally see Roy follow through on this promise. That even at his absolute lowest, he is willing to endure more pain than most of us can even imagine in order to do what he has dedicated his whole life to doing: protecting people. And it was at the end of this scene, as Roy was on the brink of passing out from blood loss but remained concerned solely with Riza's safety, that I, who had previously been quite skeptical of the man who would go on to become my favorite character of all time, finally realized that there was no one who could possibly be more worthy of becoming Führer. Most of the reactions around this scene tend to center purely around its badassery and how it's the definitive example of how powerful Roy is. And though that's definitely true, I think those comments largely tend to miss the point of this scene. Because while "you do not mess with Roy Mustang" is certainly a big takeaway from this scene, I think the even bigger one should be, you do not mess with Roy Mustang because he cares. And this is why, in spite of his many flaws, I wish I could be more like Roy. He's my hero. And I think that's how a lot of people felt after watching this scene, and why it continues to resonate with fans of the show so strongly. Because flame alchemy was never the greatest weapon in Roy's arsenal. It was always his heart. Anyways, the movie does something really stupid and makes this scene all about revenge instead of protecting people, which is so dumb because this fight isn't about revenge at all. That's what the envy fight is for. Oh wait, the movie also combines the lust fight and the envy fight. That's just fantastic. Now that Roy has closure, he can't spend the rest of the series getting consumed by vengeance and undergo a meaningful character arc in which he learns not to keep his hatred bottled up inside and to rely on the people who love him for support. By putting this scene 3 entire arcs too early, you have not only ruined my favorite scene in the show, but you have completely lobotomized Roy's character to the point where almost all of his remaining screen time is rendered utterly meaningless. Thank you so much for this absolute war crime of a screenwriting decision. It's well documented in the Fullmetal Alchemist fandom that each of the homunculi dies an ironic death. Gluttony gets eaten, wrath dies at peace, greed dies wanting nothing, and so on. And while Lust's death is the first and arguably the most memorable of any of the homunculi, the irony behind it is also the most frequently misunderstood. You'll hear variations of Lust was killed by a womanizer, Lust was killed by a man who wasn't attracted to her, or if you're particularly dirty-minded, Lust died on her knees. First of all, no she didn't. Second of all, if you think Roy is actually a womanizer beyond just a front he occasionally puts on to throw off his superiors, I'm convinced we didn't watch the same show. I assure you, the real irony of this scene is actually so much better and less sexist than any of those things. In spite of his reputation, Roy is in reality a man of immense self-control who sacrifices his personal desires for the greater good on a daily basis, including but not limited to any lustful impulses. And it's the very thing, well, person, he yearns for the most that he defeats lust in order to protect. So, in the words of a Tumblr user I very much wish I could credit, but whose username I have long forgotten by now, the true irony of this scene, and the thing that makes me and so many other FMA fans love it so much, is that Lust was killed by a man who loved.